Greenwich, Connecticut, December 25th. The snow falls like white ash over an estate built on old money and fresh lies. I am Addison Reed, and I am watching my family eat the inheritance they stole from my hands. They have just toasted to my brother's luxury yacht, a vessel paid for with the $100,000 trust that was supposed to be my life's work. They expect me to be the resilient daughter, the one who swallows the betrayal. They are wrong. In the shadows, I have been buying the debt they thought they could outrun. The bill is coming due before dessert. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. The snow fell in thick, heavy flakes that blurred the edges of the world. It was a New England snow, wet and cold, and it clung to the windshield of my car as I drove up the long, winding driveway of my parents' estate in Connecticut. The house sat on a hill, a great white structure with many windows and a roof that groaned under the weight of the winter. It looked solid and permanent, the way things are supposed to look when they have been paid for by generations of Reeds. I parked the car and sat for a moment. My hands were still gripped tight around the steering wheel. They felt stiff. I had driven 3 hours from the city, leaving the glass towers and the 80-hour work weeks behind, but the tension in my shoulders didn't go away. It had been 5 years since I stopped asking them for help. 5 years of law school junior associate grinds and living in a walk-up that smelled like old radiator steam. I had done it because I had to, and because personal freedom was the only thing worth having. I stepped out of the car. The air was sharp. It cut into my lungs and made me feel awake. I carried my bag to the front door, my boots crunching through the fresh powder. The smell of pine hit me before I even reached the porch. It was a clean smell, but it felt artificial, like everything else about this holiday. I opened the door and the heat of the house rushed out to meet me. It was too warm. It smelled of roasting turkey and expensive gin. My mother was in the foyer wearing a silk dress the color of dried blood. She didn't hug me. She touched my arm with her fingers and said I looked tired. I told her I was fine. I told her the firm was busy. She nodded, but she wasn't listening. She was already looking past me toward the living room where the fire was roaring. I walked into the kitchen to find a glass. The silver was laid out on the counter, rows of heavy forks and spoons that had been polished until they shone like mirrors. I picked up a spoon. It felt heavy in my hand. It was the weight of a tradition that didn't include me unless I followed the rules. My father was by the bar. He was pouring scotch into a crystal glass. He poured a lot of it. He didn't offer me any at first. He just stood there, a tall man with gray hair and a face that had grown hard from years of making sure everyone knew he was the one in charge. Finally, he splashed some into a second glass and pushed it toward me. We didn't talk about work. We didn't talk about my life in the city. We talked about the weather and the quality of the wood he had bought for the fireplace. That was how we did things. We talked about the surfaces of things. I moved to the dining room to help my mother with the table. The tablecloth was a heavy damask white and stiff with starch. I smoothed it out with my palms. Underneath the cloth, the mahogany table was cold. I began to set the places. One for my father at the head, one for my mother, one for me, and the largest space for Jackson. Jackson was my younger brother. He was the one who was supposed to carry the name forward. He was the one who went to the right parties and met the right people while I was in the library highlighting cases on contract law. My parents saw his laziness as a kind of aristocratic grace. They saw my ambition as a lack of refinement. I felt the phone vibrate in my pocket. It was a short, sharp buzz. I didn't look at it immediately. I finished placing the napkins, folding them into precise rectangles. I made sure the edges were sharp. When my mother went into the pantry, I pulled the phone out. The screen was bright in the dim light of the dining room. It was a message from Miller. Miller was a man I had met through a debt acquisition firm I consulted for. He was efficient, and he didn't ask personal questions. The message read, "The trucks are 5 miles out, confirming the lien is in your name. We are ready when you are." I deleted the message and put the phone back. The house was quiet, except for the crackle of the fire and the distant sound of a television in the den where Jackson was likely watching football. I walked to the window and looked out at the driveway. The snow was still falling. It was covering my tracks. I thought about the $100,000. It was a trust my grandfather had set up for my graduate education. It was supposed to vest on my 28th birthday, which had passed 2 weeks ago. I hadn't touched it yet. I had been waiting for this dinner, waiting for the moment when we would sit down as a family and discuss the future. I had plans for that money. It was going to be the down payment on my own firm, the final brick in the wall of my independence. I had worked for every cent I owned, but that trust was a debt the family owed me for the years I spent being the reliable one while they poured everything into Jackson's failures. I felt a sense of resilience. It was a cold feeling like the ice in my father's glass. I had learned early that in this family you were either the one holding the leash or the one wearing it. I had spent 28 years wearing it. That was over now. I went back to the bar and finished my drink. The scotch was good. It was expensive and it burned in a way that felt honest. My father looked at me. He looked at my suit, which was charcoal gray and tailored. He looked at my shoes. He didn't say I looked successful. He said I looked like I was trying too hard. I told him that some people have to try. He laughed, a short, dry sound that didn't reach his eyes. He told me that people of our sort don't try. They simply are. It was a lie, but it was the lie he lived by. He had never worked a day in his life that wasn't managed by a board of directors his father had appointed. I looked at the clock on the mantel. It was almost time for dinner. The smell of the turkey was getting stronger. It was the smell of a community I was a part of by blood but not by spirit. Outside, the world was white and silent. Somewhere in that silence, Miller and his crew were moving through the snow. They were professionals. They knew how to do their jobs. I felt a strange calm. It was the calm of a person who has already made a decision and is just waiting for the world to catch up. I helped my mother bring the dishes to the table. The turkey was huge and brown. There were potatoes and cranberries and greens. It was a feast designed to show that the Reeds were doing well, even if the world outside was changing. We sat down. The chairs were heavy oak, and they creaked as we settled in. Jackson came in last, smelling of expensive cologne and the cold air from the porch where he had been smoking. He looked at me and grinned. It was a grin that meant he had already won something I didn't know about yet. He sat across from me. He looked healthy and pampered. I looked at my parents. They were looking at him with a kind of pride that was almost religious. I was the daughter who worked. He was the son who existed. The silver clinked against the china. It was a sharp, clear sound. My father stood up to carve the bird. He handled the knife with a practiced ease. The light from the chandelier reflected off the blade. I watched the steel move through the meat. It was very sharp. Everything was ready. The exposition was over. The table was set, the rolls were assigned, and the debt was waiting to be called. I picked up my fork. I felt the weight of it. It was solid. I was ready to eat. The wine was a Cabernet from a valley I had never visited. It was dark, and it left a stain on the inside of the glass. I watched the stain. Jackson was talking about the hull of the boat. He used words like displacement and draft as if he understood them. He talked about the teak decking and the way the sun would look on the brass fittings. My father listened to him. He leaned forward, his elbows on the table, which he usually never did. He was captivated by the idea of the thing. The room felt smaller now. The heat from the fireplace was a physical weight against my back. I ate the potatoes. They were creamy and rich, but they tasted like nothing. I looked at my mother. She was watching me. She had a way of looking at me that made me feel like an intruder in my own life. She reached for the gravy boat and passed it to Jackson. She didn't offer it to me. "It's about the circle you move in, Addison," my father said. He hadn't looked at me in several minutes. He was still looking at Jackson. "The boy needs to be where the decisions are made. You don't make decisions in an office. You make them on the water. You make them when the phones are off and the scotch is poured." I put my fork down. It made a small, lonely sound against the china. I thought about the $100,000. I thought about the 3 years of graduate school I had planned. I thought about the applications and the entrance exams and the late nights. The trust, I said. You said you moved it. My father finally looked at me. He took a slow sip of his wine. He didn't look guilty. He looked like a man who had done something very sensible and was waiting for the rest of the world to realize it. "The 100,000 is the down payment," he said. "The rest is financed through the family holding. It's an investment, Addison, a real one, not just more books and more tuition." He spoke the word tuition like it was a disease. "But that money was for my education," I said. I tried to keep my voice steady. Hemingway once wrote that courage is grace under pressure. I felt the pressure. I held the grace. I need that for the partnership track. I need the specialization. My mother laughed. It was a short, sharp sound that reminded me of glass breaking. "Education is wasted on you, dear," she said. She leaned in, her eyes bright with a strange sort of malice. "You're already so serious, so driven. You've reached your ceiling. You'll always be a workhorse. But Jackson has the potential to be a winner. He just needs to look the part. People follow winners. They don't follow associates in gray suits." Jackson grinned. He didn't look at me. He was looking at his reflection in a silver spoon. "It's a 50-foot vessel, Addie," he said. "The Golden Sun. I'm naming it after the family legacy. I'm going to host the Miller Vane Group next month. Do you know what that kind of networking is worth? It's worth 10 of your degrees." I looked at him. I looked at the way his silk tie sat perfectly against his throat. He had never had a blister on his hand. He had never stayed up until dawn reading case law. He was a creature of the surface. "You spent my trust on a boat," I said. I said it slowly. I wanted the words to hang in the air like the smoke from the fire. "We reallocated family resources," my father corrected. He sounded bored now. "You've always been resilient, Addison. You have that middle-class grit. You can handle a little setback. In fact, your mother and I were talking. If you really want more training, there's no shame in trade school, something practical. You could learn to code or perhaps something in the medical assistant field. It's a growth industry. It's more suited to your temperament." The insult was calculated. It was designed to strip away the 5 years of professional life I had built for myself. They wanted me back in a box. They wanted me to be the daughter who served as a backdrop for the son's ascent. I felt the phone in my pocket. It was cold against my leg. I thought about the paperwork I had signed in my office 3 weeks ago. I thought about the private equity firm I had consulted for the one that specialized in distressed debt. I had been watching Jackson's spending for a year. I knew he was over-leveraged. I knew he had taken out a high-interest bridge loan from a private lender to cover the extras on the yacht that the trust hadn't reached. He wanted the best of everything, and he wanted it immediately. He didn't realize that in the world of finance, debt is a weapon, and I was a better soldier than he would ever be. "Trade school," I repeated. I let the words sit there. I took a bite of the turkey. It was still dry. I chewed it and swallowed it. I didn't get angry. Anger is a luxury for people who don't have a plan. I was a Reed, and Reeds were supposed to be winners. My father had said that. He was right, but he had the wrong winner in mind. I looked at the candles on the table. They were tall and white, and they were burning down. The wax was dripping onto the silver holders. It looked like tears, but the silver didn't care. The silver was hard. "Your brother needs the boat to network with the elite," my mother said, as if she were explaining something to a child. "He needs to be seen. You, on the other hand, are invisible in that law firm. Why throw more money into a hole? We're doing this for the family name. You should be proud to contribute to Jackson's success." "I see," I said. I reached for my wine. My hand was perfectly still. I felt a sense of clarity that was as sharp as the New England winter outside. I was a young woman in my late 20s, and I was being told that my mind was worth less than a fiberglass hull. They were leaning on American values like community and family to justify a theft. But they forgot about the other values. They forgot about the value of personal freedom. They forgot that in this country, you don't just inherit a life, you earn it. And if someone tries to take what you've earned, you take it back. Jackson started talking again. He was talking about the guest list for his first voyage. He was talking about the champagne he had ordered. He was talking about the life he was going to live on my dime. I looked at the window. The snow was coming down harder. The driveway would be difficult to navigate soon. The trucks would have to move carefully. I wondered if the repo agent was cold. I hoped he had a thermos of coffee. He had a job to do, and I respected people who did their jobs. My father started a story about a man he knew in the 70s who lost everything because he didn't invest in his image. He was using it as a parable to justify what they had done to me. He spoke about image as if it were a god. I watched him. I watched the way his jaw moved. I realized then that he wasn't a strong man. He was a man who was afraid of being ordinary. He was so afraid of it that he was willing to eat his own young to stay relevant. It was a pathetic realization. It made the room feel even colder. I didn't hate him. You don't hate the wind when it blows your house down. You just build a stronger house. Or you wait for the wind to stop, and you move into the ruins. I wasn't going to move into the ruins. I was going to be the wind. I felt the resilience in my bones. It was a hard, cold thing, and it was the only thing that was real in that room. I waited for the doorbell. I knew it was coming. I knew exactly how it would sound. It would be the sound of the debt being called. Jackson stood up. He moved with the confidence of a man who had never been hit. He picked up his crystal glass and tapped it with a silver spoon. The sound was thin and high like a bird trapped in a cold room. He looked around the table, his face flushed with wine and the heat of the fire. My father looked up at him with a smile that was heavy with pride. My mother leaned back, her hands folded over her silk lap. The room was very still. "A toast," Jackson said, "to the golden sun. She's sitting in the harbor at Greenwich right now getting the final polish. She's the future of this family. She's how we get back to where we belong. To the elite. To the winners." He looked at me then. His eyes were bright and mean. "And to Addie, our little workhorse. I know you're upset about the trust, sis. But don't worry. Once I've got the right people on board, I'll have a place for you. I'm going to need a stewardess who knows how to follow orders and keep the brass polished. It'll be good for you. You can wear a uniform and finally see how the other half lives. You won't even have to think. Just serve the drinks and keep your mouth shut." He laughed. My father joined him, a low rumble of amusement that felt like a betrayal in the marrow of my bones. My mother smiled and took a sip of her wine. I didn't say anything. I looked at the turkey carcass on the platter. It looked like a shipwreck. I felt the vibration of my phone in my pocket again. It was a long, steady pulse. That was the signal. I looked toward the window. The snow was a white wall, but then it was broken. Two beams of light cut through the dark. They were bright and blue-white, sweeping across the dining room walls, turning the family portraits into ghosts for a split second. Then came the sound. It was the deep, guttural throb of a diesel engine idling in the driveway. It was a heavy sound. It was the sound of something real. The house seemed to tremble. "What is that?" my mother asked. She put her glass down. "Is that a delivery?" My father frowned. He looked at the window. "Not at this hour. Not on Christmas." The doorbell rang. It was a loud mechanical chime that echoed through the high ceilings. It didn't belong in the silence of the dinner. Nobody moved. The engine outside continued to thrum, a steady heartbeat of iron and oil. The doorbell rang again, longer this time. "Jackson, go see who that is," my father ordered. Jackson looked annoyed. He set his glass down and walked out of the room. We sat in silence. I could hear his boots on the hardwood of the foyer. I could hear the heavy thud of the front door opening. The cold air rushed into the house, cutting through the stagnant heat of the dining room. I could smell the snow and the exhaust from the truck. There was a murmur of voices, a man's voice deep and professional, and then Jackson's voice rising in pitch, becoming defensive. "You've got the wrong house," I heard Jackson say. "That's impossible. Get that thing out of my driveway." I stood up. My legs felt strong. I walked toward the foyer. My parents followed me, their faces twisted with a mix of confusion and indignation. Standing in the doorway was a man in a heavy canvas coat and a baseball cap. He held a clipboard. Behind him, parked on the shoveled snow, was a massive flatbed truck with a hydraulic lift. The lights on top of the cab were flashing amber, casting rhythmic shadows against the white pillars of the porch. "I'm looking for the owner of the vessel registered as the Golden Sun," the man said. He didn't look impressed by the house. He looked like a man who had spent his life dealing with people who owed money they didn't have. "I'm the owner," Jackson snapped. He stepped forward, trying to use his height to intimidate the man. "And that boat is at the marina in Greenwich. What the hell are you doing here?" The man checked his clipboard. "The marina has been notified. We have a crew there now. I'm here to serve the seizure notice and the acceleration of debt. The boat is being hauled out and moved to a secure lot in Newark for public auction. I just need a signature on the service of process." "Seizure!" my father shouted. He pushed past Jackson. "That boat was paid for. We used a private trust. There is no debt." The man looked at my father, then back at his papers. "The trust was the down payment, sir. But there was a secondary lien, a bridge loan taken out by a Mr. Jackson Reed through a private lender. The loan was secured by the vessel itself. The lender has called the note." Jackson's face went white, and it was the color of the snow outside. He looked at the floor. He looked small. I just needed to cover the customization," he whispered. "The leather interiors, the sound system. It was just a small loan. I was going to pay it back with the first networking deal." "A small loan," I said. My voice was calm. It was the calm of the eye of a storm. "It was a $300,000 high-interest note, Jackson, and you lied on the application. You claimed the vessel was unencumbered. That's a breach of contract. That's a default." My father turned to me, his eyes wide. "How do you know that Addison—" "What is this?" I reached into the bag I had left by the door. I pulled out a thick manila envelope. I didn't hand it to Jackson. I handed it to my father. "I work in debt acquisition, Dad. You know that. Or you would if you ever asked." I looked at the man in the canvas coat. "Thank you, Miller. The signature is in the file. I've already authorized the seizure as the sole officer of Reed Holdings, LLC." "Reed Holdings," my mother gasped. She was clutching her throat. "What are you talking about?" I looked at her. I looked at the silk dress and the pearls. "I bought the note," I said. 3 weeks ago, when I saw Jackson's credit pull on the family's shared financial report. I knew he'd be desperate. I bought the distressed debt from the original lender for 60 cents on the dollar. I used my own savings. Every penny I made in the last 5 years. I own the boat, Mom. Or rather, I own the debt that allows me to take the boat." I turned to Jackson. He was shaking. "You said education was wasted on me. You said I should go to trade school. Well, I learned something in law school. I learned how to read a contract, and I learned that a winner is the one who holds the paper." The man from the truck tipped his cap to me. "We're moving out, Ms. Reed. The Greenwich crew is already loading. You'll have the confirmation on your phone in 10 minutes. He turned and walked back into the snow. The heavy door stayed open. The cold air was everywhere now. It was blowing the napkins off the dining table. It was freezing the wine in the glasses. My father opened the envelope. He stared at the documents. His name wasn't on them. Jackson's name was there, but it was crossed out by a legal stamp that said, "Defaulted." My name was at the bottom in bold black ink. "You can't do this," Jackson wailed. He sounded like a child. "It's my boat. It's the family's future." I looked at him. I didn't feel sorry for him. I didn't feel anything at all. I felt like a clean, well-lighted room. "It was my trust, Jackson," I said. "You spent my future on a toy, so I took your toy. That's how the world works. That's the elite circle you wanted to be a part of. Welcome to the networking deal of a lifetime." The diesel engine roared as the truck began to back down the driveway. The amber lights flashed one last time, illuminating the panic on my father's face and the tears in my mother's eyes. The Golden Sun was gone. It was just a name on a piece of paper now. I stood in the foyer, the wind whipping my hair across my face. I had never felt more like a Reed. I had never felt more alone. and I had never felt more free. The silence that followed the departure of the truck was heavier than the snow. It filled the foyer and drifted into the dining room like a fog. The front door was still standing open, and the New England winter was moving in, claiming the house. I watched a drift of white powder settle on the dark mahogany of the side table. My father didn't move to close the door. He stood there, his frame suddenly looking smaller, his expensive wool trousers sagging at the waist. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out. The resilience he always preached, that sturdy American stoicism he claimed as a birthright, had vanished the moment his son's vanity was towed away. He wasn't resilient. He was just protected, and I had stripped the protection away. I walked past him and grabbed the heavy brass handle of the door. The wood was cold. I pulled it shut, and the click of the latch was a sharp final sound that echoed up the stairs. I walked back into the dining room. My mother had returned to her seat. She sat perfectly upright, her hands clasped so tightly in her silk lap that her knuckles were white. She was looking at the center of the table, at the turkey that was now a ruin of bone and cold skin. The grease was beginning to congeal in the bottom of the silver platter, turning a milky, opaque white. It looked like something dead on a beach. "You've destroyed us," she said. Her voice was a whisper, but it carried. It was a thin, brittle sound. "On Christmas, Addison. In this house. You've taken your brother's future and you've dragged it through the mud for the sake of a grudge. Do you have any idea what people will say? Do you have any idea what this does to the Reed name?" I didn't sit down. I stood at the head of the table where the carving knife lay idle. The Reed name was already in the mud. "Mom," I said, "Jackson put it there when he signed a contract he couldn't honor. I just brought the mud into the house so you could see it. And don't talk to me about grudges. This isn't a grudge, it's an audit." My father came back into the room then. He wasn't the king of the castle anymore. He was a man with a gray face and shaking hands. He reached for the Scotch decanter, but his fingers fumbled against the glass. "This is not how we do things," he said, his voice rising, trying to find its old authority and failing. "We are a family. We are a community. There are values that matter more than a balance sheet, Addison. Loyalty, supporting the legacy, ensuring that the next generation has the platform to succeed. We made a choice for the good of the whole. We moved that money because Jackson needed the leverage to move into the elite circles. It was a family investment. You were supposed to be part of that. You were supposed to have the grace to understand your role." I looked at him. I looked at the liver spots on his hands and the way his eyes avoided mine. "My role," I repeated. The word felt like iron in my mouth. My role was to be the bank. My role was to provide the capital for Jackson's delusions while I worked 80 hours a week to pay for the privilege of being ignored. You talk about community, but a community doesn't steal from its members. That's not a value. That's a parasite. You used the word resilience earlier. You said I had that middle-class grit. Well, you were right. I have it. I have the resilience to build a life out of nothing. I have the resilience to see a betrayal for what it is and survive it. But I also have a sense of personal freedom. In this country, you don't owe your life to a legacy that doesn't respect you. You owe it to the work you do. I worked for my life. I worked for the money I used to buy that boat out from under you. I am the only one in this room who actually owns anything." Jackson appeared in the doorway. He looked like he had been struck. His hair, usually so perfectly styled, was mussed, and his silk tie was loosened at the collar. He looked like a man who had lost his skin. He leaned against the doorframe, his chest heaving. "That boat was everything, Addie," he said. He sounded like a child. He sounded like the boy who used to break my toys and wait for Mom to buy me new ones. "I had the Miller Vane partners coming out next month. I told them I was a player. I told them I was one of them. Now what? They'll see the repossession. They'll see that I'm a fraud. You've killed my career before it even started. How could you do that to your own brother?" I looked at him and I felt a strange sense of distance. He wasn't my brother. He was a bad loan. He was a liability that had finally been called in. If your career was based on a boat you didn't pay for, You didn't have a career, Jackson, I told him. You had a costume. I just took the costume back. If you want to be a player, try working. Try earning the seat at the table instead of stealing it from your sister. My mother stood up then. She walked around the table, her silk dress rustling like dry leaves. She reached out to touch my arm, her face twisting into a mask of maternal concern that was 10 years too late. Addison, please, she begged. Think about what you're doing. We can fix this. You have the papers. You have the power. Call that man. Tell him it was a misunderstanding. Tell him the family will handle the debt. We'll find a way to pay you back. We'll give you the 100,000 from the estate sales later this year. Just don't let them take the boat. Think of your father's pride. Think of the community we've built here. Don't break this circle. We're all you have. Without this family, you're just a girl in a suit in a city that doesn't care about you. I stepped back away from her touch. I felt the cold air from the foyer still clinging to my suit. It was a clean, sharp cold. It was better than the suffocating heat of the dining room. You don't have the money to pay me back, Mom, I said. We both know the estate is leveraged to the hilt. That's why you took my trust. And don't tell me you're all I have. I have the firm I'm going to build. I have the reputation I've earned in the courts. I have the freedom to walk out of this door and never look back at a family that saw me as a resource instead of a person. That's not a circle. It's a cage. And I'm done living in it. I turned away from her. I went to the closet and pulled out my heavy wool coat. It was black and functional, and it fit me perfectly. I put it on. I felt the weight of it on my shoulders. It was a good weight. It was the weight of a person who is standing on their own feet. My father followed me to the closet. He was gasping for air, his face a mottled purple. You'll be alone, Addison, he threatened. It was his last weapon, the fear of being outside the circle. You'll spend the rest of your life alone. No one will help you. No one will care when you fail. You're throwing away the only people who love you. I looked at him. I looked at the dining room behind him where the community sat among the congealed turkey and the empty crystal glasses. The room felt like a tomb. It was a museum of a life that was built on lies and theft. It was a dead thing. The love he was talking about was a transaction, and I was finished with the trade. I've been alone in this house for 28 years, Dad, I said. The only difference is that tonight I finally have a car and a place to go. I'm not throwing anything away. I'm just taking the trash out. I picked up my bag. I checked my phone one last time. Miller had sent a photo of the yacht on the flatbed moving toward the highway. The image was grainy and dark, but it was beautiful. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I looked at my father, then at my mother, then at Jackson. They were all standing there frozen in the foyer, looking like ghosts in their own home. They were the elite. They were the winners. And they were bankrupt. I opened the front door. The wind swept in fresh and biting. It smelled of the woods and the sea and the future. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't need to. The debt was settled. I stepped out onto the porch. The snow was still falling, but the driveway was clear enough. I walked down the steps, my boots crunching in the ice. I felt the resilience in my legs. I felt the personal freedom in my chest. I reached my car and got inside. The engine started with a steady, reliable hum. I put the car in gear and began to drive. In the rearview mirror, the house on the hill looked smaller and smaller until it was just a dim light in a white world. I was moving, and the road was open, and for the first time in my life, I didn't owe anyone a single thing. The driveway was a long white ribbon of ice that crunched under the weight of my tires. I drove slowly, watching the house in the rearview mirror, until the porch lights were swallowed by the swirling snow and the thick trunks of the hemlocks. The heat in the car began to blow, smelling of dust and dry air. It felt good against my face. I reached the end of the road and turned onto the main highway. The world out here was vast and indifferent. The street lamps cast long amber pools on the slush, and the salt trucks had already been through, leaving a grit on the pavement that grounded the car. I felt the vibration of the engine through the soles of my boots. It was a steady, honest vibration. It didn't ask for anything. It didn't pretend to be more than it was. I rolled the window down an inch. The air that rushed in was sharp. It tasted of the Atlantic and frozen pine. It was clean. It was the cleanest thing I had felt in years. I breathed it in until my chest ached. I drove for 10 miles before I saw them. The amber lights were flashing in the distance, a rhythmic pulse against the dark sky. It was the tow truck. It was moving slowly, hauling the flatbed with the yacht strapped down under a heavy canvas tarp. Even under the cover, the shape of the boat was unmistakable. It looked like a great white whale being dragged through the night. I pulled into the left lane and accelerated. As I drew level with the truck, I looked up. The golden sun sat high on the bed. The hull was sleek even in the shadows. It was a beautiful object, but it was just an object. It was a collection of fiberglass teak and brass that had been bought with a betrayal. I watched the way the trailer swayed slightly with the wind. It looked heavy. It looked like a burden. I thought about the dinner table I had left behind. I thought about the community my father talked about, the one that required the sacrifice of its youngest member to maintain its facade. That wasn't a community. A community is built on shared strength, not on the theft of another person's future. I passed the truck and kept going. I didn't look back again. I had made a decision about the boat while I was navigating the turns of the coastal road. My mother thought I would sell it to get my money back. My father probably thought I would use it to spite them by sailing it past their club. They were both wrong. I picked up my phone and dialed Miller's number. He answered on the second ring. The sound of the diesel engine was loud in the background of his line. "Ms. Reed," he said. He sounded tired but professional. "We're about 40 minutes out from the yard. Everything is secure." I looked at the road ahead, at the black asphalt stretching toward the city. "Change the destination, Miller," I said. "I don't want it in Newark. Take it to the dry dock in Stonington, the one behind the old cannery. I've already sent the authorization to the yard manager." There was a pause. "Stonington?" Miller asked. "That's a graveyard for old hulls, Ms. Reed. There's no showroom there. No one will see it." "That's the point," I said. "I want it out of the water. I want it on blocks. Cover it up and leave it there. Don't wash it. Don't polish the brass. Just let it sit." I hung up before he could ask why. I knew why. I didn't want the money. Not yet. The money was gone the moment they took it from the trust. What I had now was the asset, and the asset was more valuable as a ghost than as cash. As long as that boat sat in dry dock, it was a physical manifestation of the debt they owed me. It was a monument to their failure. My father would have to drive past that area sometimes. He would know it was there, rotting in the salt air, a 50-foot reminder that his son was a fraud and his daughter was the one who held the keys. It was about personal freedom. I was free of the expectation to be their bank, and I was free of the need to be their victim. I was the lender now. I stopped at a gas station near the state line. The fluorescent lights were bright and buzzing, casting a sickly green glow over the pumps. I got out of the car. The wind was howling across the open lot, whipping the snow into tiny, stinging needles. I stood there and filled the tank. A man in a heavy parka was cleaning his windshield at the next pump. He looked at me, at my suit and my coat, and he nodded. "Cold one," he said. His voice was gruff. "Yes," I said. "It's cold." He looked at the sky. "Supposed to get worse before it gets better. You headed far?" I looked toward the city, toward the skyline I knew was waiting for me. "Far enough," I said. He nodded again and went back to his work. It was a simple exchange. It was a small piece of a real community, two people acknowledging the world they lived in without trying to take anything from each other. I liked it. I paid for the gas and bought a cup of black coffee from the kiosk. The coffee was hot and bitter. It tasted like the road. I got back into the car and continued south. The resilience I had felt in the house was different now. In the house, it had been a shield. Out here, it was a compass. I thought about the trade school comment. I thought about how they had tried to diminish my intellect because it made them uncomfortable. They wanted me to be small so they could feel large. But the world is not a dining room in Connecticut. The world is a place where you are measured by what you can survive and what you can build. I had survived them. Now I would build. I thought about the office I would open. I thought about the cases I would take. I wouldn't be a workhorse for a firm that didn't know my name. I would be the name on the door. I would be the one who called the notes. The $100,000 was a high price to pay for that realization, but as I watched the miles tick away on the odometer, I decided it was worth it. You can't put a price on the moment you realize you don't have to go back. The city appeared on the horizon, a cluster of lights glowing against the dark belly of the clouds. It looked like a bed of embers. I felt a sense of relief. In the city, I was just another person moving toward a goal. There was no legacy to uphold, no son to support, no elite to impress. There was only the work and the result. I thought about the dinner I had left behind. By now, the plates would be cleared. My mother would be crying in the parlor. My father would be staring at the empty space in the driveway. Jackson would be drinking the rest of the scotch, trying to figure out how to tell his friends that the boat was gone. They would be together in that big white house, and they would be more alone than I had ever been. Their community was a vacuum. It was a space where things went to die. I was alone, but I was full. I was solid. I reached my apartment building at 3 in the morning. The streets were quiet. The snow had turned to a fine mist that hung in the air. I parked the car and sat for a minute listening to the engine cool. It made a series of small metallic clicks. It was the sound of something settling. I took my bag from the passenger seat. I felt the weight of the manila envelope inside. It was just paper, but it was heavy. I walked to the front door of the building. The lobby was warm and smelled of floor wax. The doorman was asleep in the chair behind the desk. I didn't wake him. I took the elevator to the 12th floor. The hallway was silent. I unlocked my door and stepped inside. My apartment was small. It was minimal. There were no family portraits on the walls. There was no damask tablecloth. There was a desk, a chair, and a view of the bridge. It was mine. I went to the window and looked out at the water. The river was dark and moving fast. I thought about the boat in the dry dock in Stonington. I thought about the snow falling on the canvas tarp. I thought about the long road I had driven to get here. I felt the exhaustion in my bones, but it was a good exhaustion. It was the kind of tired you feel after a day of honest labor. I took off my coat and hung it up. I put the manila envelope on the desk. Tomorrow I would call the liquidator. Tomorrow I would start the process of turning the debt into a foundation. But tonight I would sleep. I went to the kitchen and poured a glass of water. I drank it slowly. The water was cold. It was simple. I looked at my reflection in the dark glass of the window. I looked at the young woman in the late 20s who had walked into a trap and walked out with the trap in her hands. I looked at Addison Reed. I was alone, and the car was in the garage, and the house was far away. I was fine. It was a clean feeling. It was the only feeling that mattered. The engine of the car ticked as it cooled in the quiet city night, marking the final beat of a long and difficult journey. That was the story of Addison Reed, a woman who proved that resilience is the best investment one can make. If you enjoyed this narrative, please subscribe and leave a comment. We read every single comment to hear your thoughts. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Revenge Hour. We'll see you next time.